it's Christina from Our Wood Home. Welcome back to my kitchen. Today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about sourdough. I'm going to be doing a series on my blog and here on YouTube as well, just talking about some things I've learned about sourdough since making my starter in April 2020. So let me preface by saying I'm not an expert. I don't claim to be an expert with sourdough or baking or anything like that. I know with sourdough especially, there's lots of different ways to go about making a starter, maintaining that starter, baking with it, and all that sort of stuff. So if you have a different method that works for you, or if you've heard of a different method, that's great. I'm not saying this way is the only way to make and maintain a sourdough starter, but I just wanted to share with you what I do because a lot of people on my social media and my blog have been asking me about that. So right now I'm just going to feed my sourdough starter, and then I'll sit down at the table and talk to you a little bit about how to create your own starter. So let's get going with this. So I feed my starter once a day now, and I'll go over all of this later in the video, but right now I'm just going to be giving this jar a mix, dumping out half of it into my discard container, which I keep in the fridge, and then I'll feed my starter with equal parts flour and water. I just have my jar on an upturned cast iron loaf pan just so that it's in the frame a bit more. There's no other reason for that besides that one point. So I've mixed, as I said, I mixed it all together before I discard it. And now I'm just going to add equal parts flour, water, 1/3 cup of each. I'm just using regular white flour today. And the water I'm using is just tap water. I'm on a well, so my water is not chlorinated. It is filtered, but that's it. And you want to make sure that you're using not cold water, not hot water, kind of just lukewarm water, I guess. And when you mix, you have to make sure that you're scraping the sides and the bottom to make sure all that flour gets wet from the water. We don't want any dry flour or any clumps or anything like that. Alright, so that's nice and mixed. I'm going to put my cloth back on, secure that with an elastic, and set this aside. So now let's go sit down and I'll talk to you a little bit more about making a sourdough starter. Let's get into some sourdough starter basics. I'm just going to be referencing my blog post on my iPad because I don't want to forget anything. And if you would like to read that post instead of listening to this video, I'll leave the link for the post in the comments or the description of this video. So I started my sourdough starter in April 2020, near the start of the pandemic. I wasn't just one of those people that jumped on the sourdough bandwagon because of being stuck at home all of a sudden. It was something I wanted to do for quite a while. Somebody gifted us with a starter and I didn't really know what I was doing with it, so I ended up kind of killing it.
What I ended up doing is just mixing it in with
baked with it, but I decided
my
I wanted
discard
to make my very
pile.
own starter from scratch. So I did a fair bit of research and tried to figure out the best method for me and just experimented to see if that actually worked. So I kept notes and I put all that into my blog post, which is going to be the first post in a sourdough series. So let me go through what exactly a sourdough starter is. So it's a mixture of flour and water that's left to ferment at room temperature. Once it's matured, it will naturally leaven your baked goods instead of using commercial yeast, which is awesome. Typically, starter is made from equal parts flour and water, but different recipes have you using different quantities of each. A lot of recipes also refer to sourdough starter as capturing wild yeast, which kind of made me uneasy. That just doesn't sound very nice. So I prefer to think of sourdough as just fermented, which makes it a lot easier to handle. A lot of people on my social medias asked me how I made my starter, because even that process is kind of intimidating if you don't know what you're doing. So to make your own, what you're going to need is a food-safe container or jar. I've used wide mouth mason jars, but I've also used big measuring cups, bowls, whatever. My preference is jars though, just because I have a lot of them. You're also going to need something to cover it with. I use a little scrap of cotton, but you can use paper towel, coffee filter, even plastic wrap that's just loosely placed over the jar or container. And if you are using a canning jar, you can actually turn the flat lid upside down and put that gently on your jar and loosely screw the lid on. You need to make sure that the jar can breathe. You're also going to need a safe drinking water and some flour. What I mean by safe drinking water is something that is safe to consume, because it's going to be going into your starter that you'll be eating. I use well water. I haven't tried it with chlorinated water or bottled water. I would say to do your own research about if you can use chlorinated or any other type of bottled water, but I just use well water because that's what I have. What else do you need to know? So what you'll do is get your jar or your container. I'm just going to say jar for the rest of this video because that's what I use, but it's interchangeable with any kind of container. So get your jar, make sure it's nice and clean and dry, and then mix equal parts flour and water into your jar. I've done a cup of water and a cup of flour every time that I've fed my starter, and that seems to work pretty well. Again, you want your water just to be warm, not hot, not too cold. Make sure you mix it really, really well and cover it and set it aside. Then in 12 hours, you're going to go back to that starter and feed it the exact same way. Quarter cup flour, quarter cup of water, mix it really well, cover it, set it aside. And then in another 12 hours, so your starter has now been alive for 24 hours, you're going to scoop out half of it, which is known as discarding, set that aside. And then you will add another 1/4 cup flour and 1/4 cup water, mixing it well and covering it. I keep my discard in a container in the fridge because you can bake with it. It just doesn't have any rising power, but it adds a lot of flavor and depth to baked goods. You can get rid of your starter, not your starter, you can get rid of your discard, but it seems kind of wasteful to me to just throw it in the garbage because it's something that can be used. Getting back to the starter itself, you're going to want to feed your starter every 12 hours. This is going to help it grow and mature, and even if you don't see any bubbling or rising right away, just continue to discard and feed. If your house is especially cold, it might take a little bit longer to establish, but following these steps, you should have no problems. Since sourdough is a living organism, it needs to be fed so that it can grow and be strong enough to leaven your bread. If you don't discard any of it, it will continue to build up in volume, but there's going to be too much competition for food inside your jar, so it won't grow. It'll just kind of starve itself. The discard is useful, as I said, because it can add a lot of interesting flavors to baked goods. You can throw it out. If you choose to throw it out, do not put it down your drain. It's going to cause a mess with your plumbing. You don't want that. You can keep it in your fridge or have a jar in the freezer that you just constantly fill, and then when you're ready to bake something, just take it out and thaw it. You can also mix it in with poultry feed if you have chickens. I don't know about any other livestock, but chickens love it. Just mix it in with their regular feed and give it to them as a little treat. You can also put it in your compost pile if you do that. It's up to you what you choose to do with your discard. For feeding of your starter, you always want to feed it in equal parts water and flour. While the starter is maturing, twice daily feedings are really important. I've actually traveled with my starter because I didn't want to miss a feeding. I've taken it to my in-laws' house and brought my little jars of flour and water from home and fed it there. I feed my starter equal parts water and flour, 1/4 cup of each. When the starter is maturing, the twice daily feedings are important, about 12 hours apart, but it doesn't need to be exact. I discard and feed my starter at around 7:30 each morning and then 7:30 in the evening. As I said, it doesn't really have to be exact. You could go 7:30 in the morning, like 8 o'clock at night. Maybe one day it's around 7 in the morning and then 7:30 at night. It's okay if there's a little bit more space than just 12 hours. But while it's maturing, you want to just make sure that you're consistent with the twice daily feedings. The flour that you use is really up to you. I chose to make my starter with white flour because that's what was available to me. When the pandemic started, flour was one of the things to sell out very quickly in stores. So while I was making my starter, I just used whatever flour I could find at the grocery store. Usually it was just plain white flour. I did use some whole wheat flour to make a starter for somebody else. And I sometimes feed my flour or feed my starter whole wheat flour if I just want a little bit of a different texture or taste to my final bread. But I suggest while your starter is maturing that you feed it consistently the same type of flour. I've had a lot of people ask me if you can kill a sourdough starter, and that was something that I was curious about as well before I actually started making mine. So the answer is sort of yes and no. If your starter becomes moldy at any time, you need to get rid of it. Don't try to scrape the mold off. Just get rid of the whole thing. Put it in the compost or put it in the garbage. One of the reasons for mold growth could be that you didn't sanitize your jar or container that your starter lives in. It could also have gotten mold if it's in the air and you have your starter uncovered completely, or if fruit flies got in there, or just something else. There's a whole bunch of reasons it could get moldy, but if you see mold, get rid of it, start over. If you forget to feed your starter, and it starts to look kind of slimy, you can revive it and keep it alive. From what I gather, using chlorinated water kind of prevents your starter from growing. It kind of kills the good bacteria. So if you suddenly switch from using well water or bottled water to chlorinated tap water, you might not see any growth in your starter. But oftentimes a starter is going to maybe look dead but still be alive. If you see no bubbles or if there's kind of a grayish liquid, it's still alive. You just need to revive it. And if you do see that gray liquid, that's a sign that your starter is hungry. Since it's a living thing, it needs food. When there's no food to consume, the bacteria in the starter releases a waste, which looks like a grayish liquid that's sometimes kind of clear, maybe a little bit yellowish. Sometimes it looks oily or slimy. It might look like dirty water as well. If you see that on your starter, don't be alarmed. It's perfectly fine, it's perfectly safe. If you do see that, you can choose to carefully pour it off. You can just get rid of that down the drain or in the garbage. Or you can just mix it into your starter when you're getting ready to discard it and then feed it. This substance is called hooch, and it's not dangerous to consume. I often have my discard jar in the fridge with a pretty thick layer of hooch because I'm not feeding it fresh flour and water, but it's fine. When I go to bake with my discard, I just mix it really, really well, and that hooch liquid is all incorporated and it doesn't affect the baking at all. So if you have made your starter and you're thinking, great, I'm gonna start making sourdough this weekend, I hate to disappoint you, but it's gonna take a while. It's gonna take about 4 weeks for your starter to be mature enough to actually leaven any bread. After a few days of feedings, you should see some activity in the form of bubbles. With regular feedings, your starter should start to double in size. What I liked to do in my early days with my starter was to put a rubber band around the jar where it was full. So it was usually towards the bottom. And then throughout the day, I could see how much it had grown and then deflated again. You might read online or in books, or someone else might have told you that once a starter doubles in size, it's ready to make bread. And that might be true, but I've chosen to let my starter just continue to grow for at least 4 weeks. I think I actually did between 5 and 6 weeks with my starter, and then I tried making bread. It's definitely a long time to wait, and I got pretty impatient, but thankfully there's lots of recipes that use the discard, so you can still make bread using regular yeast and just add the discard in for some nice sourdough flavor. I will be sharing some recipes for using the discard, so make sure you are subscribed to my channel or my blog to get those recipes in the future. I'm gonna put up on the screen my very first attempt at sourdough bread. Let me rephrase that. My first successful attempt at sourdough bread. There will be a link in the description of this video about my failed attempt with sourdough. It was definitely worth the wait to get my first successful loaf. It was really exciting. I'm glad that I waited the 5 or 6 weeks. Right now I'm to the point where I'm making bread almost every week. Well, definitely every week, sometimes twice a week. We really enjoy eating sourdough bread and it's really fun, and this is the first time I've ever actually been successful with making bread. I've tried in the past to make yeast bread and it just didn't work out. It was very difficult for me for some reason. It was really discouraging as well. But we've enjoyed the sourdough bread. We find it's just easier to digest and doesn't feel as heavy in our stomachs when we eat it, so that's really nice. Plus it just tastes good. So again, just a general disclaimer, I'm not claiming to be a sourdough expert. If there's anything I've said in this video that you personally disagree with or you've heard conflicting information about, that's fine. Everyone is welcome to their own opinions, and I know there's lots of different methods for making and maintaining a sourdough starter. This is just the one that I've used and I found it successful, which is why I wanted to share it with you. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you found it interesting. If you're wanting to make a sourdough starter, I hope it helps you. And if you have no interest in sourdough, I hope that you just enjoyed learning a little bit more about it. As I said, in future videos, I will be talking about some discard recipes as well as going through the process for making the bread that I always make. If you want to see those videos, please do consider subscribing to this channel.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoy this short little clip of my sourdough starter over the course of 12 hours. I really like it because you can see how much it grows and then shrinks back down, and you can see all the bubbles and activity. Again, thank you for watching. Please do consider subscribing or just leaving me a comment down below.